Please bear with me a second. There we go. So the recording has just started now. Yeah, so thank you again, everyone, for coming along. We're really excited for the talks that we're going to have today and what looks to be a really interesting discussion. As I said, it will finish promptly at 11. And the theme for today's talks is anxiety in times of crisis in relation to ecological, pandemic and nuclear anxieties. So as you may know, this event has come about through a research project at the University of St Andrews called Eco Warriors. And the project has been examining the lived experiences of anxiety of people across the UK who are involved in climate action. So the team working on this project includes both Dr. Bridget Bradley and Dr. Rika Hirose, who will be speaking today, as well as myself. And through this research, which is ongoing, we've had the pleasure of being in conversation with Dr. Susan Wardell and Dr. Panu Pihkala, whose wealth of experience on relating to eco-anxiety has really enriched our research and provided some really valuable insights. So we're really excited to be able to bring these two researchers, along with Dr. Bridget Bradley and Dr. Rika Hirose, together today for this discussion, which will be an interdisciplinary panel exploring anxiety in times of crisis. And they're each going to be talking about this from their own contrasting but actually quite overlapping areas of expertise, which will include eco-anxiety, coronavirus anxiety, and nuclear anxiety. So thank you again as well from our four speakers for joining us and sharing your insights on this topic, which we're really looking forward to hearing from. So by means of a very brief introduction before we launch into the talks, Dr. Susan Wardell, who's going to be given the first talk, is a professor in anthropology at the University of Otago, New Zealand, and has research interests that include emotion and affect, health and illness, and grief and memorialization. The second talk will then be from Dr. Rika Hirose, who is an early careers researcher in human geography and has a focus on the relationship between nuclear decommissioning and public engagement, as well as related environmental issues. And Rika is also the research fellow on the Eco Warriors project at the University of St Andrews. Next, we will hear from Dr. Panu Pihkala, who is an adjunct professor of environmental theology at the University of Helsinki, and also the leading Finnish expert on interdisciplinary research in eco-anxiety and ecological emotions. And last but not least, we'll hear from Dr. Bridget Bradley, who is a lecturer in social anthropology at the University of St Andrews, and has research interests in mental health, activism, kinship, and is also currently the principal investigator of the Eco Warriors project. So we will have each of these 4 short talks, which will be roughly about 10 minutes, and then we will open up to questions at the end. So as I said in the beginning, but for anyone that may not have joined at that point, you're free to post your questions into the chat during the talks. So if anything pops into your mind and you just want to make sure it's recorded there, feel free. We will also, of course, have the opportunity to ask questions in person at the end. So you can choose which you prefer. I will try and get through all the questions in the chat, but of course, feel free to mention or to ask your question directly if you prefer, and we'll just do that through the raising your hand function. Okay, so I think that's all the practical aspects out of the way. In which case, I'll move on to introducing Dr. Susan Wardell. So we're really delighted to be including Dr. Wardell today in this talk. Dr. Wardell is a researcher and lecturer in social anthropology at the University of Otago, and her research is predominantly focused in the area of medicine and psychological anthropology. Her research interests include emotion and affect, care and grief, memorialization, health and illness, as well as mental health. And recently, she's been drawing on her background in communication studies to explore these research interests in relation to digital spaces and practices. So in her talk today, I believe Dr. Wardell is going to be discussing COVID-19 anxiety in New Zealand and eco-anxiety in online environmental doomer groups, considering how emergent social categories and or medical classifications shape possibilities for care responses to collective anxieties. So I'll hand over to you, Dr. Wardell.
Kia ora koutou katoa, no mai haere mai, which is hello to you all and welcome along this evening in Te Reo Māori, the Indigenous language of Aotearoa, New Zealand. It is such a pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you so much to the UK team for organising this event and for giving us the opportunity to have a discussion about what is still relatively a niche area academically and yet is becoming such a pressing topic in the lives of so many people at this point in human history. A little bit of an intro about me was already given, so I don't need to expand too much on that. But what I've chosen to talk about today, perhaps foolishly, is two different case studies and then to draw some connections between those. So what I'll be doing is presenting one slide and a few comments related to some insights from, from personal experience and also from some of my research around medical crowdfunding on the period of lockdown in New Zealand last year, and then moving on to speaking a little bit about a study of environmental doomers, as one colloquial term for them, in online spaces, and drawing on the topic of eco-anxiety around that as well. And then I'll have my final slide to draw some connections. So a little bit of context about COVID-19 in New Zealand. New Zealand had a very early and strict lockdown response to COVID-19 in March of 2020. It was a rapid implementation of strict lockdown protocols. We spent 33 days at level 4, and then we moved down through different alert levels over a period of 80 days, and 80 days later we were back to alert level 1, which is our kind of normal level. For many of you in other places in the world, that may seem quite astounding. This elimination strategy was only possible because we're a small and geographically isolated country. So within a population of 4 million, ultimately the strategy has led to under 3,000 cases of COVID and just 23 deaths over this period. There was a really high level of public compliance to this lockdown, even though it was quite early and not many other countries had taken this approach yet. A large part of this was formulated around a really positive, effective regime that was driven by popular Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, with lots of rhetoric around the team of 5 million and uniting against COVID. Despite this, we do know that it was a period that caused significant strain to the population. And one particular recent comprehensive survey with a representative sample of the population looked at the impact of psychological distress on the population and found that 30% of respondents did experience moderate to severe psychological distress. And of those, there was 1 in 6 that specifically met the diagnostic criteria for having moderate to high levels of anxiety. There are some interesting patterns in that. For example, very even between men and women, which is actually quite abnormal compared to what other countries have noted, and even to the baseline of measurements of anxiety in New Zealand. And also young people were particularly affected by this. One thing that's been noted in analysis of these figures is that much of the anxiety in New Zealand didn't come directly from illness or from bereavement, but rather it was a kind of secondary effect based around things like social isolation or economic strain during this period. But certainly it shows us pretty quickly that anxiety was very much present despite these really positive regimes of everyone being in this together, and that also it was unevenly distributed. So where my research comes into this is I had a grant to study medical crowdfunding in New Zealand and the patterns of kind of performance of illness, marketisation of suffering, and patterns of care and empathy around medical crowdfunding. So this took a little tangent during COVID, as so many people's research did, and I developed a focus on a particular subset of campaigns that were for medical crowdfunders who did not themselves have COVID, had other medical issues, but chose to bring the pandemic very actively into their campaigns. So there are a few interesting insights that this generated. One thing was that during this time, the public health rhetoric in New Zealand laid out an emergent social category as a focus of a lot of attention. And this was the category of vulnerable people. So this was very fluid and informal to begin with. It was stated around things like age and also immunostatus, so particularly people who are immunocompromised, but it wasn't very formally designated. And from what I understand at the moment in the UK, there's similar categories around vulnerable people, but they're much more formalized around letters being issued by medical professionals and people having sort of formal documentation that they fit into this category of the vulnerable, which is quite different to how it was initially used in New Zealand. But at this time, it was very much a focus of encouraging the public to sacrifice personal freedoms through adhering to strict lockdown protocols on behalf of these vulnerable people, and also to reach out socially and offer them informal support. So what was interesting here is that crowdfunding is very much a social phenomenon where people are competing for care. So at a time when the pandemic was pressing on everyone's minds, people who were already ill with other types of illnesses or needing other types of medical assistance had to present their suffering in a way that looked deserving alongside of all of these other pressing concerns. And they had to express good pandemic citizenship by showing care and understanding for others. So there were a lot of statements such as, we know this is a hard time for everyone, but, at which point people would proceed to state their own case. Now, some of the people in these campaigns were those who aligned with the government's definition of vulnerable people. And many of them very poignantly expressed this lived experience of being, for example, immunocompromised, such as in the quote on this slide, which describes this landscape of risk and fear in which they lived for this period. However, other people who were crowdfunding did not fit this type of vulnerability. In fact, many of them had actually been made more vulnerable by the lockdown policies that were instituted, which included massive changes to the healthcare system, closure of most physical facilities, online appointments, delays and postponements of treatments, all sorts of different changes, which have had many flow-on effects on well-being. And of course, changes also to movement and gathering, which limited their social support. So what was particularly fascinating was that both groups used this idea of vulnerability to mobilize care according to locally specific pandemic discourses. So they presented themselves as vulnerable in a way the public would understand and respond to. And yet the category itself really didn't have room to encompass all the different types of stress and strain and anxiety that the survey may have indicated within the formal category. But people worked with it and worked around it in this interesting way. One final comment on this that's quite interesting is that vaccines have since been rolled out based also on categories of risk and vulnerability. But my emergent observations there are that there has been a shift from vulnerability as kind of inherent to the individual, sort of characteristic, to more emphasis on different demographic populations, such as Indigenous people, and also vulnerable contexts, such as border workers or healthcare workers. This, however, still does skip a lot of people who have felt strain and anxiety and experienced risk due to their own particular status and context. For example, supermarket workers. And I have a forthcoming paper about these experiences with one of my postgraduate students, in which we're able to map out in their own words the level of anxiety and stigma and social rejection that these people experienced during the pandemic. And despite some level of kind of public discourse about their heroism and attempts to recognise that in short-lived social media campaigns, there was very little actual training, support or compensation for these particular people and their experiences of anxiety and risk during this time. So it is an interesting case study of particular emergent social categories specific to the pandemic crisis and how these both did and didn't represent the experiences of people within that crisis and the uneven spread of anxiety. So moving on to a few comments now about a different study which predated my work on medical crowdfunding. And this was supposed to be a relatively small scale study for me in 2019, drawing on some of my interests in the anthropology of emotion and digital spaces and mutual care support groups. And it focused in particular on this group, the near-term human extinction group, which is a term that designates people who understand the effects of climate change as being likely to lead to the demise of the human species within 5 to 10 years. So these are people on the far end of the scale of eco-aware citizens, if we were to make a scale based on optimism and pessimism, perhaps. But their insights and their experiences and their approaches to dealing with the emotions about this impending species extinction do have resonance and insight for many other people living in this Anthropocene era as well. There's a few statistics on the slide there about the particular online groups. They're not the only groups, there are other smaller branch groups of this movement. They're international, but if I had to pick a skewing, although these things are difficult to determine through digital ethnographic methods, I would have said they're mostly middle-class people with a greater number of them in Western countries, to use a broad term. So the groups mainly exist as a kind of mutual support group through which people are processing grief and fear and discussing quite practical questions sometimes about how to live and also how to live well at what they understand to be the end of human history. So there's much less emphasis on these groups on resisting or delaying or countering climate change. Some of the groups actually actively ban survivalist or prepper discussions or posts, which of course are very active groups in other parts of the internet. Some of them also ban any posts to do with Extinction Rebellion. And this represents a fairly active rejection by some people, not everyone, but some people in the groups, of climate activism as being futile or too late or misguided. So there's more focus instead on acceptance and on processing these questions of what do we do now and what do we do with these emotions. What these people experience is very little public space for their suffering to be valid or understood. And as this quote on the screen represents, there's a kind of politics of knowledge about climate change that their distress is tied to. They are very invested in data and graphs and predictions, but they experience themselves as kind of lonely prophets. So connecting with others in this space, making their own space, is in itself a remedy or a balm to the layer of stigma and social isolation that creates a lot of pain for them alongside the grief or anxiety directly related to climate change as they see it unfolding around the world and in their own immediate environments as well. They are actively trying, from what I've observed, to find terms and language to share with the public, to make their experiences understood. And to do this, they draw on quite a bricolage of tools and terms from other places, which is something I've ended up writing a little bit more about coming out of my initial intentions to study the group directly as I diverted to study their kind of public writings instead. So for example, there's a lot of reference to the 5 stages of grief, and they're often generating their own resources that they're then shared with the public. But as they draw on categories that have so much baggage behind them as kind of biomedical terms quite often, or terms associated with certain bodies of academic literature, there's also quite a strong resistance to framing their suffering as individual or psychological or pathological. And they prefer to emphasize the structural and ecological context in a problem that's out there rather than inside of them. Despite this, there is still a need for additional support structures, and many people write about their engagements, their very mixed engagements and experiences with mental health professionals from their stance within this movement. So just a few comments now, which I'm sure the other speakers today will also draw on in their own talks, and which we'll have an opportunity to discuss. in terms of what the connections might be between COVID anxiety in New Zealand's lockdown and eco-anxiety in these particular groups. One fairly perennial point, I think, is that whenever we're talking about something like anxiety, there's considerable ethnocentrism built into medicine and psychiatry, and filtering into these conversations in social science too, when we are attempting to map or pin down emergent crisis experiences in a positivistic way. So it's all very emergent, but I think social scientists have important work to do here in recognizing this kind of struggle for authoritative discourses and knowledges about what is actually happening here, and being part of the voice to ask people to attend to the role of power in that, but also to sort of counter a very ethnocentric version of that that's likely to bubble to the top. The second point is that clearly anxiety and other forms of distress are unevenly distributed for a lot of reasons. And there's a lot of collective language that calls these crisis experiences unprecedented, and that we are all experiencing the same thing at once. But we mustn't forget that we're on the same sea, but not in the same boat, as one of the circulating memes about this quite thoughtfully has presented as well. Additionally, there are many people left out of measurement or labelling about the scope or scale of these forms of distress, because their type of distress or their own categorization of that doesn't fit those that are formally recognised. So one of the reasons that is so significant is that particularly in bureaucratic neoliberal nation states, formal care and access to support, whether that's publicly funded psychiatry or welfare benefits, relies on classifying and labelling people. So there's always pros and cons to being labelled, and that labels miss some people who need access to that support, but that also it can label some people who don't recognise their experiences in that particular framing and don't wish to. And there are always going to be moral and political and existential repercussions to how people are labelled. The final point I'd like to make there is that in both the groups that I've looked at here, people have been presenting their sort of hard-won wisdom, sort of a knowledge from the margins to others in quite a generous way. So the near-term human extinction folk have often talk about caring for each other, but also caring for the wider world as death doulas, as society becomes more eco-aware, to draw on their own knowledge that they have gained through living through anxiety and grief themselves, and to use that to kind of usher other people through those experiences. In parallel, the crowdfunders I studied often used this interesting trope of offering wisdom to the people they were seeking donations to, something akin to crip wisdom or wisdom from the margins that were based on their experience of illness or disability pre-pandemic, that also involved social isolation and sharing these tips and tricks with others to help them cope with COVID anxiety too. So both of these observable practices make it clear that the types of suffering that these groups are navigating are not only psychological or individual, but they're existential and moral and practical. There's this generative relational element that I think needs to be acknowledged in these experiences, in the way that crisis creates new ways of being and also new ways of being together, new forms of sociality. And that's an important task to map these in a holistic way that goes beyond understanding anxiety as something that's individual and internal, and is able to locate it as social and cultural and local sets of experiences. And I will leave those comments there and look forward very much to seeing what others bring forward and connect. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wardell, for that really interesting talk. And I'm already seeing quite a lot of parallels between the research that we've been doing on eco-anxiety. So Tons of questions are coming up for me, but I will wait till the Q&A to ask those. I'm sure other people have thoughts as well. So like we say, we'll do the questions at the end of the 4 talks in the question and answer session. But for now, I think next up is Dr. Rika Hirose. So Dr. Rika Hirose is an early careers researcher, and her PhD degree is in sustainable development in the field of human geography. Her doctoral thesis looked at the relationship between nuclear decommissioning and public engagement from an intergenerational justice perspective. So she's interested in scrutinizing challenges to manage different kinds of environmental problems that include climate change, pollution, and resource depletion. And she's currently working as a research fellow on the Eco Warriors project at the University of St Andrews. So Dr. Hirose will be talking about the normalization of catastrophe and anxiety in Japan after Fukushima, and examining the reaction of Japanese population in the time of nuclear crisis, extending to other threats such as earthquakes, the pandemic, and climate breakdown. So Rika, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. Now I'm just going to share my screen. I hope it's working.
Yep, that's great.
Yes. So hi, I'm Rika, and today I would like to talk about the state of mind of people in Japan after the catastrophe, which happened 10 years ago. Let me briefly explain what happened then. The largest earthquake in the history of Japan hit the northern part of the main island. The quakes was followed by tsunami, and this tsunami had waves up to 40 meters high, which wiped away several coastal towns. So Fukushima Daiichi power plant, a nuclear power plant, was located alongside this coastline, and it was flooded, lost electricity, and with such system failure, there was 3 reactors melted down. There were explosions to follow in the course of 4 days, and a significant amount of radioactive material was released into the environment. So 10 years later, even today, several towns in northeastern Japan are still empty. And in total, about 500,000 people were forced to evacuate from their homes as a result of this catastrophe. It's been more than 10 years, but about 37,000 people are still living as evacuees. Government is trying to bring back as many people as possible to the area and spending billions for surface cleanup. However, the threat is not over from the nuclear power plant itself, and the melted cores are still burning, and they're pouring water onto them to cool them down, and water is accumulating at the site. And after 10 years, there are more than 1.2 million tons of contaminated water stored in more than 1,000 tanks on site like this. And now they are talking about releasing this water into Pacific Ocean after some treatment. But there's also another problem because the contaminated soil is also accumulating and from the cleanup operation. They are packed in bags and piled around all over Fukushima. And the government wants to use this soil to build roads and infrastructures, claiming that it's safe to use them because they will be covered with, by asphalt and concrete. There's obviously a strong opposition to these ideas, but it seems that the government is quite determined. So, by the government, you may know that in 2013, then Prime Minister Abe declared that the situation is under control and there will be no problem coming from Fukushima. This was when he was appearing to host for the 2020 Olympics. So the Japanese government had to prove that everything was under control, and they relaxed standards and lowered the safe dosage limits for air, soil, and food. There was a massive campaign to promote the safety of Fukushima food. And as you see, Mr. Boris Johnson here, he also contributed to promote the Fukushima peach juice in back in 2017 when he was finance minister. Foreign secretary. But many local people was skeptical about methods that they've been using to measure the radioactivity. For instance, if you have a ton of rice, they would measure one part of rice, and if it's above the limit, they would just take another part from different section, and if that part is lower than the limited level, then they would they say everything, all whole tons of rice is okay. So things like that was actually happening, and but all of this made it easier for the Japanese government to declare that some areas are safe to return, and the financial support for the evacuees were terminated to encourage them to return in 2017. But only about 28% of the evacuees actually decided to return, claiming that they didn't feel safe enough to go back. So there is a clear indication that the majority of people in Japan do not trust their government. In fact, the safety of Fukushima, in fact, the more the government stressed the safety of Fukushima, people turn away from their narrative. This has a lot to do with with obvious misinformation that the government was trying to convey, starting from the very beginning, denying meltdown in the first 3 months. Eventually, they admitted that there was a cover-up after, well, it took them 5 years to admit that there was a cover-up. They finally admitted it later in 2016. And revising and expanding evacuation zones several times also fueled public anxiety. And the government and their acknowledged experts actually made so many dubious comments, some of which are in the red boxes here. So, like, radiation is good for you. The plant will only take 40 years to decommission, and it was the testing which made increase the number of thyroid cancer among children, etc., etc. Although many people were skeptical of the government, and they were basically saying that we are doing right and everything is okay, this narrative actually didn't catch the people's heart, and in general, people were just in shock and they just didn't know what to do. So the way Japanese government was handling this catastrophe polarized the reaction of the public people. On one hand, people became super anxious, and they became very sensitive about the radioactive contamination, and some started monitoring, for instance, some started monitoring radioactivity on their own since they didn't trust the official figures from the government. But this also revealed the monitoring scheme by the government, like their position of the official monitoring post, which was posted position too high, and not really measuring what is affecting the people, especially children on the lower ground. And some people also became very like a phobia, and they were scared of anything coming from Fukushima, including people, evacuees. And unfortunately, there were several cases of discrimination towards evacuees reported, and especially in schools. And indeed, some of these cases were due to phobic overreaction, but general tendency also turned to blame the people who were worried about radiation in general, saying that the impact was so small and worrying is making things worse. So many people actually participated also into activism, especially the anti-nuclear activity to stop the nuclear power plants. But this activity was often considered antisocial, and movement got smaller. It was quite big for the first couple of years, but it got smaller after a while. So it's also reported in the media that many people lost their jobs for going against the governmental policy, and people just became very scared of losing their jobs and their friends. And there was also a notion of apathy, and some did not find, did not want to think about this accident, and they thought it was meaningless to do something. And I remember my colleague saying to me that, he said, I know the things are not right, but I have to accept this because I was born Japanese. And another colleague of mine said that he was very scared and he was so worried, but he had to pretend that there's no problem because he was afraid that he didn't want to scare his family and especially children. So there was a complex mixture of fatalism, nationalism, and paternalism. And from what I've seen, many people just decided not to talk about it. And they just wanted to go on with their lives. And of course, there's other things to worry about for the people who live in Japan. And one of them is the earthquakes. So at least 2 mega earthquakes are expected to hit Japan in next 30 years. Japan is located at the intersection of 3 tectonic plates, which makes the country very prone to large-scale earthquakes. And also it has more than 100 active volcanoes. And biggest one, Mount Fuji, is supposed to it's supposed to have erupt every 300 years, and it's longer overdue. The last eruption happened in 70s. This is actually the history of Mount Fuji eruption, and last one happened in 1707, and when according to record, when that happened, more than centimeters of ashes covered as far as 150 kilometers, which is Tokyo. And Japan has been preparing and encouraging people to do the take precautions, and there are like prepper goods everywhere, and the buildings are built with like technology of like anti-earthquake technologies, but depending on the scale of the disaster, no one actually knows what to expect. And we should also not forget that there can be unexpected side effects from an earthquake, like what happened at Fukushima. And face also a pandemic, and Japan is now supposed to be under the 5th wave of COVID in Japan. Japan had a relatively low impact from the pandemic during the first year, but cases, this is the daily cases, well, the cases spiked in November and in May. And it's very difficult to determine why the numbers were lower and why the numbers went up all of a sudden, but still, so this is a comparison, and the red one is Japan, and but it has a relatively higher number than than its neighboring states in neighboring countries in Asia. And one thing we know is that the government has been slowing down the number of testing from early on, and there were so this is the chart of testing, and the green one in Japan, and people just stayed home. People just stayed home even when they had severe symptoms because it was so difficult to get testing. So the positive rate was like more than 20% last in January, and it's going down, but it still has like 5%, and it's much higher than other countries, obviously. And so actual number of cases could be bigger. And so there was again a stigma towards people who caught COVID, and many people who caught COVID, they hid the fact that they had it. And again, Japanese people are not happy of the way the government handled this situation, and especially in relation to Olympics. So many people speculate that the number of the cases and gravity of the situation was downplayed in order to go ahead with this Olympic. Recent poll actually showed that 86% of people were afraid that the Olympic will worsen the situation, COVID situation in Japan. In fact, it was actually reported just yesterday that already 6 people who came into Japan for Olympics tested positive, including athletes. So there are protests every day, like to say stop to the Olympics, and many volunteers quit because the government, well, they didn't think it was safe to do volunteer work at the Olympics. But government decided to hold the games in a half-empty stadiums, and they are saying there is no problem. So I should also mention that the climate change has impacted Japan already quite heavily with increased storms, floods, and droughts. And the country expects further damage from rising sea levels and temperatures. So there are lots of other issues such as aging population, declining economy. So yeah, so how are the Japanese people doing in terms of mental health? And Japan is already notorious for high suicide rate, and the number of suicide. This is the suicide chart. It's been it's been declining since 2011, and I think that the peak was in 2008 or so. But then it is suspected that this will start to increase again because of COVID. The latter half of 2020 has seen significant surge of suicide, and notably more young women are now taking their lives. So this is a study by OECD, and they compare the prevalence of depression and anxiety before and after COVID, and light blue one is after in 2020, and as you can see, there's so much increase in 2000 everywhere. So before ending, I just wanted to say that there are also many movements to change the current way the country is being run in Japan, and numbers are still small, but we are hoping that something will change. And yeah, so that's it for me now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hirose. That was so interesting to hear all about the different kind of forms of anxiety that are intersecting in Japan, and particularly what you mentioned about the kind of distrust in the government narratives. I think it's really interesting. So I'd love to come back to that in the question and answer session at the end. But yeah, so thank you again. And we're going to now move on to our next talk, which will be Dr. Panu Pihkala. So I'm really delighted to introduce Dr. Panu Pihkala today. He is an adjunct professor in environmental theology at the University of Helsinki, and is the leading Finnish expert on interdisciplinary research about eco-anxiety. So he has published monographs in Finnish about eco-anxiety and ecological emotions. And among other positions of trust, he serves as an ambassador to the Finnish National Project on Social and Health Sector Responses to Eco-Anxiety, and has been awarded several prizes in Finland for his published work. So his talk is going to be about eco-anxiety in Finland and the relationship between various kind of global anxieties, describing the Finnish research on eco-anxiety and situating it in the context of a theoretical research about eco-anxiety and various global anxieties. So with that, I will hand over to you, Dr. Panu Pihkala.
Thank you, Hannah. Greetings, everyone. Terveisiä Helsingistä in Finnish. Thank you already for the two previous speakers. There would be much to discuss, but I'll try to restrict myself and stick to the original plan of this presentation first, and then we'll engage in the rich joint discussion. So I'll be introducing eco-anxiety research in Finland. Here we are as Finns, so far in the north, almost on the altitudes of Alaska, so in the very northern part of Europe. This is what it traditionally has looked like during winter, and still sometimes does. We are not as heavily affected yet geophysically by the climate crisis as, for example, Japan is. We also have more intensive heat waves. For example, the storms are getting more intense, but we are still relatively safe. But what we are losing in southern Finland is snowy winters, for example, which have been culturally very, very important, and that actually has direct impacts statistically also on mental health because of the darkness that is strengthened because of lack of snow. So this is also related to the impacts of climate crisis around here. So I've done a fair amount of work on various forms of ecological distress, eco-anxiety, difficult ecological emotions, many terms can be used. I'll not be speaking much about that work today because I'll focus on Finland, but I'll mention a couple of resources if somebody wants to check them out. This article called Anxiety and the Ecological Crisis, available freely online from last autumn. That's a sort of wide literature review from many disciplines about related phenomena. About coping with eco-anxiety and related issues, there's an article called Eco-Anxiety and Environmental Education from last December. So education is used in a very wide sense in that article. It's closely related to communication overall and interaction between people. And finally, about climate grief or sadness, including longing for snow in snow-filled countries. There's an essay available in English at the BBC Climate Emotion series. Much of my practical work is available only in Finnish, but luckily at least some of it is in English, and Google Translate is also amazingly good nowadays with even Finnish. That's the power of algorithms nowadays. So those websites that I'll be mentioning in this talk, which are in Finnish, can actually be quite easily translated, especially if you are using the Chrome browser. You can just right click and then translate it. But moving on to the Finnish context. So we are a small nation, population roughly 5.5 million, far in the north, but the Atlantic Gulf Stream warms the country, at least so far. So actually one of the biggest threats related to climate change is that if it changes the causes of these sea currents, we might have very, very different climate in Finland. So nobody knows if that will happen. It's so complex, but that's a major fear here. The high levels of education and strong trust in science, which have an effect also on people's attitudes towards what is here roughly called eco-anxiety. Traditional social democracy has been strong, but also in the 2000s, we've seen rise of right-wing populism as in most European countries. There's mostly progressive environmental politics in Finland globally compared. However, for example, forestry is a heated discussion, and there's disputes about the Finnish views regarding European Union forest policies, for example, and big, very emotional debates among Finns related to the uses of forests. So some people are opposing clear cutting, for example, both for climate reasons and biodiversity reasons, but the official forest policies are still heavy geared towards very intensive forestry, for example. So eco-anxiety, ympäristöahdistus is the Finnish word for eco-anxiety. Literally translated, it would be environment anxiety. We use a lot of joint words in Finnish language. That's part of the Finno-Ugric languages, which is sort of exotic globally. In Europe, there's only us, the Estonians and Hungarians who belong to that language tradition. And then there used to be many small tribes speaking relative languages in the area of Russia. Unfortunately, many of them are fading out. But anyway, ympäristöahdistus breached national consciousness in autumn 2017. I personally had a part in that. I published my first monograph about eco-anxiety that autumn, and it became a much discussed book in the Finnish discourse. There's some reflections of that in an essay I wrote for the Climate Psychology Alliance. There's the link if somebody wants to take a look. And by the way, in one way or another, these slides can be received after the presentation if somebody wants. So between 2017 and 18, the concept was new and not yet politically loaded, which made conversations easier. There had been some sporadic mentions of related terms before, but the national discussion really grew very intensively after 2017 and even more so after 2018. But also, what happened was that between autumn 2018 and winter 2019, there appeared identity politics around terms, especially climate anxiety. So in both my theoretical work and in Finnish language, we separate between general eco-anxiety and then more specifically climate change-oriented climate anxiety. And we have words for both of them in the Finnish language. So especially ilmastoahdistus, which is climate anxiety, became a word used by the Environmental Party as a sort of rally call to do more progressive climate politics, and then used in a pejorative sense by the right-wing populists, saying that don't be a hysteric person who has climate anxiety type of rhetorics. Now in autumn 2019, a second book about the topic was published. That time I focused more on the wide scope of ecological emotions and feelings. And I'm mentioning this not only because it's always nice to talk about one's own work, but also because the scope of discussion in Finland has moved to recognizing also many other feeling tones and not just anxiety. And especially many artists, educators, and environmental communicators in Finland have picked up the topic of the affective dimension and doing various kinds of work in relation to it. As a result, many Finns know about the subject, but naturally there are disputes, for example, those related to various kinds of identity politics that I mentioned. But also there's been a relatively strong public validation of the general phenomena, because so many people have lifted up their voices and said that, hey, I feel some kind of distress related to this. So there's been a change, and globally compared, this seems to be rather special. Of course, Sweden is a special case also, and the work of Greta Thunberg and other young climate activists is a very much known but also very much disputed factor in Sweden. But I'll move on to speak about some surveys and other research that we've done among Finnish people in relation to eco-anxiety and especially climate anxiety. There's empirical observations, and I also in my free time do some workshop leading. So it's been interesting to facilitate workshops about ecological emotions for climate activists, for example. So there's all sorts of observations that inform my work, but not so much academic stuff based on that, at least not yet. There's high environmental concern and climate concern in surveys. Of course, the issue of social desirability is always present here. Nowadays, the situation has turned so that in order to be a good citizen, one sort of should say that one is environmentally concerned. Then there are, of course, many kinds of minority identities where opposing these framings might be the source of group identity, but that's another thing. In 2019, surveys started to include ympäristöahdistus in various ways, and it was increasingly noticed, especially in empirical studies with interview methods, and some old studies revealed information. So, for example, studies which used biographies related to environmental action. And in those written texts, one can see lots of instances of various ecological emotions and eco-anxiety, even though those terms usually were not used earlier on. The Finnish Mental Health Society has done some pioneering work. They have a very sort of proactive approach towards mental health and try to remove stigmas around it. They try to oppose too strict framings of between positive and negative emotions, and arguing that emotions are part of life and they should not be too strongly and prematurely evaluated as something good or bad. So there were pilot discussion groups for people with strong eco-anxiety in spring 2019. There was 2 of them. I was co-facilitating and leading them with professional psychologists. I have the background of interdisciplinary research and also research in worldviews and religion. We can talk about that more in the discussion if somebody wants. So it was interesting to observe the dynamics of these facilitated discussion groups. 2 major observations were that first, it really benefited the people who took part, and second, it was actually not easy to get people enrolling and committing to the groups. There's some dynamics which are common for all kinds of mental health and well-being and emotional skills groups. But then there's probably also the fear of stigma, people thinking about that, do I have such a strong eco-anxiety that I need to go to a facilitated discussion group type of thing. And this has continued also with the National Social and Health Sector project around eco-anxiety. So one-time events, it's easy to find people participating in them, but groups that require some more commitment, like 4 or 5 meetings, it's much more difficult, even though we have lots of evidence that we have many people feeling strong ecological distress. There's a report in Finnish by these pilot discussion groups. I wrote it. If somebody is interested, I can send it, and Google Translate will save the day, hopefully. And there's also a longer report about climate anxiety and ways to cope with it from summer 2019. Mental Health Finland translated that into English, so that's available online. I did a sort of review of various methods that internationally had been developed to do constructive coping with these difficult emotions and mental states. My work is really strongly emphasizing the fundamental non-pathological character of this phenomenon at large, and the concept of eco-anxiety is of course a sort of social construct which captures many particular phenomena, and then we also need more explicit discussion about those various phenomena that are included in it, and among those of course are some forms and manifestations where people benefit greatly from even clinical support, but that's only one part of the phenomena, and if we are talking about it more widely, then there's all kinds of things. So there was a national survey in Finland about climate emotions in 2019. I was taking much part in preparing it together with climate psychologist Kirsti Jylhä. Kirsti has been researching social dominance, orientation, and climate change denial mainly, but also climate emotions. There was a nice number of respondents. Of course, not all of them completed the whole long survey, but still a lot. And we used 26 different emotion feeling words, and there's all sorts of complexities related to self-recognition of emotions, and especially self-recognition of climate emotions. Time doesn't allow me to go into that now, but I'll just say that there are these complex dynamics. Some emotions are more difficult to self-recognize than others. For example, interest was the feeling that gained most approval. This may be a sort of, if I'm not able to pick anything else, at least I'll pick interest. That may be one dynamic. A more optimistic take would be that people are genuinely interested about climate matters. Frustration was very common, and from the open-ended answers, one could see that many respondents were frustrated because of the slowness of climate politics, and some people were frustrated about the whole topic of climate change. This goes more to the disavowal denial type of position. Feeling inadequate was recognized a lot. This is an important feeling which is not so easily named in English language as it is in Finnish language. So again, we come to this cultural and linguistic dimension, that some emotions have better words in certain languages and not in others. So this is sort of between guilt and shame, which is an important tone, I think. Feeling powerless was quite commonly recognized. Hope also. Interestingly, the oldest people had much more hope than the youngest ones, and one may then talk about different forms of hope, for example, wishful thinking or constructive hope and so on. Sadness was quite generally recognized by people from all ages, which is very interesting in relation to climate sadness. Feeling skeptical was admitted and self-recognized by 32%, fear 31%, anxiety 25%, and anger 31%, for example. Desire to do good and pay one's dues 31%. Hyvittämisen halu in Finnish, that's a tricky thing to translate. So here's an example of some of the climate emotions and the self-recognition levels in that survey. We are preparing academic articles based on that data, but academic work takes a lot of time, as many participants here know, and especially during times of COVID-19. But there's a short communique at the web page of Sitra, the Finnish Innovation Fund, and there's the nice collection of the central results, and they are translating these into English now during the summer, so they will be available later on also in English. Some observations, I'm trying to be mindful of the time also. Gender and age had strong impact on recognition of emotions and anxiety. The segment between 15 and 30-year-olds, anxiety was recognized by 33 to 38%, depending on the way that the question was posed. So much more than the average. Women 32, men 18. Older people over 65 reported much less difficult ecological emotions. For example, guilt was self-recognized by 31 of the youngest segments and by 17% of the oldest segment. There are some understandable psychological and cultural reasons for this, but I'll not go into the details now. And disavowal and denial are probably quite heavy here also. Economic situation also had a strong impact. So if you didn't have much economic resources, you were also more worried about climate change. This was the sort of result from that area. We also inquired about strong psychosomatic symptoms, which is still relatively rare in research. Strong despair was self-recognized by 12%, fear states 10%, depression 9%, some decrease in functioning 6%, sleep disturbances 5%, some difficulty to breathe 5%. We have a term for that in Finnish. Heart beating fast 5%. Some nausea or stomach symptoms a bit less. So the sociologist doing the compilation of the survey results was arguing that not many Finns experienced strong psychosomatic symptoms. I sort of disagree that I think that on a national level, if we get numbers like 10% people self-recognizing fear states related to climate change, I think that's a lot, even though one takes into account the complexities in self-recognizing. So many Finns identify with some kind of ecological distress. Milder forms, roughly 25 based on many surveys, stronger forms, less than 10. Especially climate anxiety has become a politically loaded concept, and public recognition and government-funded projects about eco-anxiety have enabled people to experience validation. There's two projects that I want to mention. One is the Social and Health Sector project, which has 3 persons employed annually, funded by the Ministry of Social and Health Matters. There's the website. And then there's an educational project, which has provided resources for teachers to help process difficult emotions related to global problems. So we've been sort of training teachers in workshops so that they could use the same methods with their students. And that's the website for them. Now, I had some concluding remarks about global anxieties, but sort of I'm mindful that we all have spoken quite much longer than 10 minutes. So it may be that I actually skip this and leave this for the joint discussion so that we have ample time for that. But with just a brief mention that the dynamics between various global anxieties have interesting similarities and some, also interesting differences. I'm very happy that this conference was organized, and this is one occasion where we can talk more about that. But at this point, I thank you for the attention, and I'm looking forward for the joint discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pihkala. That was a really insightful talk. And yeah, please do feel free to share your reflections on global anxieties in the discussion section at the end. And there was also some really interesting parallels between what you were talking about, like the stigmas attached to eco-anxiety, again, with what Dr. Hirose has been saying as well. So I'd love to come back to that too. But our final speaker, coming up next, it will be Dr. Bridget Bradley. So Dr. Bridget Bradley is a lecturer in social anthropology at the University of St Andrews, where she teaches topics of global and planetary health. And her research interests include mental health, activism, and kinship. Her PhD, which she completed at the University of Edinburgh in 2019, explored British and American experiences of body-focused repetitive behaviour. Bridget is currently the principal investigator of the project Eco Warriors, which examines the lived experience of anxiety of people involved in climate action across Britain. And her talk is going to be about anxiety among climate activists in Britain, so sharing some of the initial findings of this ongoing research. And with that, I'll hand over to you, Bridget.
Thank you so much, Hannah. And thank you to all of the speakers already today. I mean, this is just such a great opportunity to start the conversation and share some of our work. So I'll try to be brief so we can move on to the discussion and questions. In this kind of short talk today, I'm going to run you through a bit of the research that, as Hannah mentioned, we've been doing as a team on eco-anxiety and activism in Britain. And I'm going to connect some of these themes to my earlier work, which Hannah mentioned was on body-focused repetitive behaviours, but also looked at themes of mental health and activism. So as you've heard, from Hannah, and we've been working on this project at the University of St Andrews. We were lucky to get some funding from the Scottish Funding Council, and this funding allowed me the opportunity to get some early ideas off the ground, and was really part of a wider effort from the UK funders to kickstart research that was halted due to the pandemic. So it was a very short burst of funding, which ran from January and will end next month. And it allowed us to explore a new area of research for myself, which I'd been interested in really since completing my PhD, and that's the relationship between eco-anxiety and activism in Britain. So in January, I was able to hire our wonderful team who helped me to complete this research project within a really tight time frame, alongside my teaching commitments and everything else. So big thanks to Hannah and to Rika and our other research assistant Eleonora for their hard work in bringing all of this together over the last few months. So our general goal was really to conduct a pilot study of experiences of eco-anxiety among what we called climate activists, but this really included anyone who resonated with that term and anyone who was involved in kind of climate work, protest or action, who was living in Britain from the age of 12 and up. We were particularly interested in the experiences of young people, although this was a group that in the end we really struggled to recruit participants from, and I think we only managed to interview one person under the age of 18, which was disappointing, but highlights the kind of ongoing necessity to talk to the younger people. So from March to May, we ran virtual interviews with around 40 individuals between the ages of 17 and 80, and almost all of whom were from mostly white middle class backgrounds. And during this period, we also ran 3 separate focus groups, one on the topic of gender, one on the topic of raising children during the climate crisis, and one on the topic of politics. And these focus groups allowed us to bring people together in a virtual group setting and to see group dynamics, which was great. We also collaborated with 2 climate organisations, the Climate Psychology Alliance and Reboot the Future, to run some group events where we were able to participate and observe in the different workshops that these organisations were running with our invited research participants, both of which proved really useful and interesting opportunities. So since our project really has just finished, we haven't had much time to analyse or write up the findings yet, but our event today is a great way to kind of share some of our early ideas in conversation with Dr. Wardell and Dr. Pihkala, who Hannah mentioned. We've been reading their work along the way and has inspired us to think more broadly about anxiety among global crises across the pandemic, and with Rika's work on nuclear risks as well. So the topic of language and labelling for me was, sorry, that was my slide about the project. The topic of language and labelling was one that really led me to this research in the first place, because it has a link to my previous work. So my previous work was on a completely different mental health experience, of course, of those who have compulsive hair pulling. But one of the major findings to come out of that work was the importance of naming and the importance of labelling, not only informing community bonds, but also offering people a real sense of belonging that helped them to make sense of their own identity and subjectivities. And in the context of hair pulling disorder, this process of finding out the name, which was trichotillomania, was incredibly meaningful, because most people had lived with the condition for many years in deep isolation, often pulling out their hair in secret, not understanding where the urge had come from, and felt like they were the only one in the world who suffered from this quite unusual problem. And therefore, going from this experience of isolation to finding out that there was a medical name for their hair pulling It gave people a great sense of legitimacy and made them actually feel more normal because they had a medical reason and a language to attribute to their inexplicable embodied experience. And so while others have argued that psychological labels can often bring a great sense of stigma, making people feel like they are irrational or abnormal, in the example of hair pulling, I argued that the opposite was actually happening, that this psychiatric label helped people to feel more normal and they had been previously feeling like a freak, as they often put it. And so labeling allowed people to make sense of what they're going through, to form relationships with other people who shared the label, which led to important care networks that often mirrored what they were expecting and hoping for from family members that they actually rarely received. And so these bonds of relatedness with other people who shared the label in the community also influenced their awareness raising and anti-stigma work on behalf of the community and the kind of activist threads. So I came to this work on eco-anxiety with that in mind. And I was trying to unpack the relationship between anxiety and activism. So wondering how people come together through these bonds of solidarity through the label of eco-anxiety. Eco-anxiety is kind of a fairly new label in the UK. We've seen popping up across the media over the years. So I was interested in how this label might have brought people together. And of course, as we saw in my example of hair pulling, there was one concept that I developed out of that work, which was biosolidarity. And I used that to explain the way that communities with a shared biomedical label form bonds of solidarity that then lead to advocacy work. So that can then help to raise the profile of the community and the wider struggle and the issues that they're trying to address. So this idea builds on another concept which is popular in medical anthropology called biosociality, which describes really the social networks that come around labelling that Susan kind of hinted at as well. So thinking about biosolidarity gives us a chance to look at the focus on social justice and activist work that actually emerges through these bonds, which I think first and foremost can come through labels. So that was, we'll come back to that in a minute, but I suppose it was the focus on activism and the relationship to anxiety that interested me the most, and that's something that hasn't really been looked at much in the literature. So some of the core findings that we found emerging from this short project was that actually people did not resonate with the label of eco-anxiety at all, which was fascinating. But although that was the case, it was still drew people in as a kind of recruitment tool. So people resonated with it enough to sign up to our research. But then when we kind of started to unpack the language a little bit more, we found that other terms were much more powerful in trying to represent what people were experiencing. So there was quite a bit of pushback against the language of anxiety. People felt that it didn't really represent their emotional or psychological response that they were having to the climate crisis. And other researchers have suggested this as well, that grief, fear, anger, sadness, distress and despair, and we've seen this in what Panu's just presented on, that the wide range of emotions that people feel are relevant. And actually it was interesting to see from his survey results there that anxiety is one of the lower ones that people are selecting, but there's still kind of a wide consensus of that term. So potentially I would consider if that's around the stigma of the word anxiety and the stereotypes of what it might resonate with, people feeling like an anxious person, a typically anxious person. And that could be a result of some of the media portrayal of so-called snowflake generations in the UK, in Britain, and those that are worried about climate change and those that are not. And this raises some interesting questions, of course, about how the representations of language and labelling might be actually counteractive to the activism that certain groups are doing and moving away from certain words or language in order to allow the cause to kind of become stronger and more acceptable. And there's a clear kind of sensitivity that I think was coming through from the language of anxiety, and a sense of weakness, perhaps, that people were keen to distance themselves from, which I think has really interesting links to what Susan was talking about in terms of vulnerability and how people imagine vulnerability, as well as Panu's work on identity politics and the disputes around these terms. So another thing that came out of our work is the question of how people manage their psychological responses to this climate work. So again, the relationship between labelling and the different forms of care that come out through these labels. So many people that we'd spoken to had gone through some kind of counselling or psychotherapy, but they were also very resistant to the idea that this was a pathological problem that required a psychiatric or a biomedical treatment. So quite the opposite, in fact, and I think as Panu has said, people felt like this was a very rational response to the reality of the climate crisis, and that this, and Susan has said this too, that the sickness is actually the wider kind of social and global context that surrounds it, rather than an individual pathological problem. And this is in line with a lot of the literature that's written on this topic as well, and that links to our kind of global experiences of crisis like the pandemic, and to nuclear activity, distrust in the government, and things that Rika has highlighted. And we also have been thinking a lot about activism as a remedy for anxiety, which we expected to see quite a lot of, and has been mentioned in the literature that activism and action can help people to deal with these feelings. But we also found the opposite for some people, which was interesting, and that getting involved in activism can also make anxiety worse, but can also lead to a kind of a new level of stress and burnout, which can complicate mental health experiences further. So from today's discussion, I think questions about what labels are doing for different people, what do they mean, and what types of care and activism do they open up or close the door to in different contexts and for different people. And in finally, kind of a thought of biosolidarity again, trying to push this concept a little bit further, and thinking about what the bio refers to in biosolidarity. In one sense, it does refer to biological conditions or biomedical labels, but I'm wondering if we also consider that to include our wider connections to biodiversity, biodiverse beings. Does it allow us then to think more broadly about the bonds of solidarity and networks of relatedness that are actually extending beyond the human, and helping us to see how these bonds of solidarity are actually shaping activist practices and giving focus to the different ways that we care for each other in a time of crisis. So those are just some thoughts from me and from our team. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Bridget. That was really interesting to hear. And I think now we have time for the Q&A section. So perhaps the questions that you kind of finished off with there at the end is a nice place to start. If anyone in the audience wants to ask any questions, you can either type it in the chat and I can read it out, or you can raise your hand, which you can just do. There's 3 dots at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can just click that and then click raise hand, and then it will come to you and you can ask your question directly. But I don't know if any of the other speakers had perhaps a response to Bridget's questions at the end of that talk. Oh, and I'll just stop the recording as well. 1 second.